And then the last question we had, so is it just explaining training intensity levels for skiing and the best method to determine them, considering that most people don't have access to a lab to do it with to do a VO2 max testing. So training intensity, so it's kind of a two-parted question. The first part, so training zones or training intensity zones for skiing. So typically most people use 5 zones. That's what we use here. So you have a level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. Level 1 is a very low intensity, typically, you're not pushing. If you do have an idea of what your heart rate max is, you're working, around 60-ish% of that is level 1. Level 2, yeah, you're looking at, it's a little bit, so it's like a moderate activity. This could be something if you're out for a long ride and, you're wherever you are in the country, if you have a 20-minute climb, you might dip into level 2 a little bit there because you're just working a little bit harder. So that's just like a moderate activity. It's not something that you want to train at all the time, because sometimes you don't get that much more benefit from it, and it can make you take a lot longer to recover from a session if you do it all at level 2 versus level 1. So it's good to do it if you're focusing on your technique, or if you're kind of on undulating terrain. Some of the harder terrain parts of the terrain, you might dip into level 2 a little bit. And then level 3 is really a big zone a zone that is used quite a bit and emphasized a lot in skiing. So that's kind of your threshold zone. Especially if you're looking at, longer distance races, marathon events and things like that, this is kind of where you're going to be able to operate, is right in that level 3 zone. So that's, typically up to around 80% of your heart rate max, is kind of the top end of that level 3. So 70 to 80% of your heart rate max typically tends to be your level 3. So, if you have access to a heart rate monitor, or you wear that, you can look back on some races or, really hard efforts you've done and maybe get an indicator of your heart rate max, and then look at the percentage of that. And that can give you a good idea of what your level 3 will be. But yeah, level 3, it's right before you're working right in that zone before things start to get really hard. So before you start to accumulate lactate is what the term is. So yeah, that's really where you're working if you're doing marathons, things like that, longer sustained efforts that are still harder. So that's that zone. Level 4 is that's really like a harder race pace. So if you're doing 10Ks or 15Ks or 5Ks, that's kind of that race pace zone. And typically intervals get to be quite a bit shorter when you're doing the level 3. So anywhere from like 2 to 5 minutes would be maybe an interval. The length of an interval for a level 4 session or a level 4 interval. So whereas level 3, you can really do anything from 6, 7, 8 minutes up to 15 or 20 minutes, even some people do, of intervals, like for one interval within a set. So yeah, that's level 4. And then level 5 is really just like the highest. It's that highest intensity. So that typically in skiing, that's like speed work. So, if you're doing speeds on your skis or running, that's kind of that level 5. So it's something that you really can't sustain for very long. It's not something, you can go and hammer out for an hour or even 10 minutes. It's really just like that high intensity speed work where you're not actually stimulating your cardiovascular system quite as much, but you're really trying to stimulate the muscles and get that neuromuscular adaptation. So that's kind of the answer to part 1. Part 2, how do you assess these things? So if you don't have access to a VO2 max, so yeah, the best idea then is to look at if you have a heart rate max, and then looking at in the training peaks, we have level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It says like the percent of heart rate max that you want to work at. So it's always a zone. So you can look at that and deduct those values based on if you have an idea of a heart rate max. That's the best way to do it. So yeah, in a way, that's the way a lot of skiers do it as well, because a lot of people don't have access to labs. That's a really expensive equipment. So yeah, those are the answer to those few questions from the chat.
So I would just mention that I use a Suunto 9 barrel watch, and that records time, on a given workout, that records time in all 5 zones.
Yep, that's great.
Which is very good. I can look at, and that I can map against perceived exertion as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I think that's one thing that I actually didn't mention would be perceived exertion, because it's not quite as objective and it varies from person to person, but being able to understand or know, and this comes with experience and time on skis and training, like your level 3, you should have a good idea if it's too hard or too easy. And that's something that we look at. And same with your level 1, you should be able to go out for a hour and a half to 2 hour session, and you shouldn't be totally done at the end of it. You should know if you're that's another thing to look at as well. So, but yeah, no, having a watch that does those things is really beneficial, and it's nice that that's something that we just can have and utilize today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.